That's my cue to start. Welcome to the AUBER Roundtable. This is your place to hear your current thoughts on a wide range of economic topics throughout the year. In this session, we're focused on the housing market and, because of its direct connection, the construction sector. There are a small number of topics in life that can take a room from calm to action movie tense. Housing's one of them. The discussions and debates are passionate and are too often divorced from data and trends. As economists rooted in data and trends, it can sometimes get a little awkward. That being said, there are a lot of good questions to be asked to begin to construct forecasts that make sense and to analyze those trends. Speaking of construction, someone needs to actually build the homes, the office buildings, the warehouses, not to mention a growing list of necessary infrastructure. With the pandemic, the challenges of that process went from difficult to mind-blowing, as both the labor market and the commodities markets shifted in unimaginable ways with the speed of a waning summer. That is where we pick up our discussion today with an incredible panel that has all of the answers, or at least they're willing to field the questions. We invite you to be part of the conversation today by adding your questions through the Zoom Q&A button, which you'll find in your toolbar. To get us started, it's my pleasure to introduce my fellow board member of AUBER, Jennifer Green.
Thank you so much for the introduction, James. Greetings, everyone. My name is Jennifer Green, joining you from Jacksonville, Alabama, where I'm the director for Jacksonville State University Center for Economic Development and Business Research, and a current board member of AUBER. My task today is to share a little bit about our AUBER organization before our excellent roundtable panel we have prepared for you. And I thank you all for joining us. I promise to keep my comments brief. So a little about AUBER. AUBER is the Association for University Business and Economic Research. This year, AUBER is celebrating its 75th year, as it was founded in 1947. AUBER is the premier professional organization for regional economics centers across the United States, with members from leading universities and affiliate organizations. Our membership includes economists and researchers in public and private universities who are dedicated to continually improving the quality, effectiveness, and application of research in business, economics, and public policy. This applied economic research and data promotes informed decision-making and strengthens business and public sector environments. AUBER provides many educational networking and collaborative opportunities, such as this roundtable today. My membership with AUBER has been invaluable. I began engaging with AUBER when I first began my director position here at our center. The professional relationships I've been able to develop with members from all over the U.S. has been phenomenal and very helpful to my research and career here at JSU. It has also allowed me the opportunity to reach out and find out how other states are tackling major public policy issues such as Medicaid expansion. So I cannot say enough of how enriching my experience has been with AUBER, and I'm so thankful to be a part of this outstanding organization. For those participants that are not current members, we hope you will consider membership. You can find a lot of information on our website at www.auber.org. And a near future date to put on your calendars is October 15th through the 18th. We will be having our 75th annual AUBER conference in Pensacola, Florida, being sponsored by our colleagues at the Haas Center at the University of West Florida. We would love to be able to provide you with a big in-person AUBER welcome. Before we jump into our conversation about housing today, I was asked to share some brief thoughts on other items that are on our minds as AUBER economists. One such topic that has been on my mind a lot lately is physical infrastructure development and the issues surrounding this topic, such as those that Jackson, Mississippi is currently facing. Physical infrastructure is not a sexy topic in economic development circles. Who really gets excited about talking about wastewater technology? Especially in more rural areas, the hot topics or what city or town is getting a new Dunkin' Donuts, or what new industry has been recruited. It is all about the new shiny things you can see above ground that tends to get politicians excited. But physical infrastructure and the proactive community planning that is needed is crucial to economic growth. It directly supports economic production and distribution in the economy. It is a matter of national security, as it is the backbone of our energy, irrigation, transportation, telecommunications, banking, finance, technology, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to share any statistics or numbers, as we are all from different parts of the country, but I do urge us all in our respective communities to really think about our physical infrastructure and the role we as economists can play in sometimes bringing light to the more non-sexy topics that are crucial to our collective economic growth. So to move our program forward, I would like to introduce fellow AUBER board member, Vanessa Fry. Vanessa is the interim director of Idaho Policy Institute at Boise State University, where she leads students, staff, and faculty in providing innovative and objective research to help public, private, and nonprofit leaders overcome challenges and navigate change. She has focused both her work and education on utilizing multi-sector, evidence-based solutions to address persistent social, environmental, and economic issues and meet the current and critical needs in communities across Idaho and beyond. Vanessa.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be with my AUBER colleagues here today, and to be with other colleagues who I am going to introduce now. And I'm really excited to be able to share the next hour with them and with you all. So without further ado, we have three amazing researchers with us today. Holly Urbis is a regional economist at Housing and Urban Development's Office of Policy Development Research in the Region 10 office, which is up here in the Pacific Northwest. Drew Sanderford is the Robert M. White Jr. Bicentennial Associate Professor of Real Estate Finance, and he is also general faculty in the McIntire School of Commerce at the University of Virginia. He's also the founding director for the school's Center for Real Estate and the Built Environment. And finally, we have Ken Simonson with us today. He's the chief economist for the Associated General Contractors of America, and he's been in that position since the early 2000s. So thanks to all of you for joining us today in this AUBER roundtable discussion. So we're going to first start by asking a question that we want you all to tackle. And it is maybe a tough one, because we're going to ask you to narrow down your thoughts on this. What do you believe are the two factors that are the largest things that we as economists should be focusing on within the housing and the associated construction market? And I'm going to go ahead and pitch that to Holly first.
All right. You're right. It is a difficult task to narrow it down to two things. So what I've come up with, the two things that I'm currently most interested in when I'm doing my research are resettlement patterns since COVID with remote work, and just kind of how that has changed, demand for units, and, where people live, work, and all of that is pretty impactful for what I do. And additionally, demographics, I think, are going to be a really key factor moving forward with, everybody knows baby boomers are aging and passing. And, we've got the millennials, and each group kind of has different wants and needs. So looking at those are important.
Great. Thanks, Holly. Ken, what do you think?
Well, first, I, as the fellow and former president of the National Association for Business Economics, I welcome the contact with AUBER. You guys go and sponsor a joint meeting that we have every February or March, an economic policy conference in Washington, D.C. And so I hope to see many of you at the next version of that. In terms of the indicators I look for on housing, a very short-term one that we got this morning is the latest mortgage rate. The 30-year fixed mortgage rate jumped to over 6% for the first time in many years. And there seems to be a close correlation to people's ability or willingness to buy a house as soon as that rate changes. For the longer term, certainly I agree with Holly, the demographics, specifically population growth within a state or a metro area, and also migration in or out of the area make a huge difference. And then the age categories, so that you're looking at the demand for different types of housing. So if you're getting a lot of young singles, chances are more multifamily housing. If you're getting a big growth in the oldest age brackets, again, that might lead to demand for multifamily because people want to give up having to take care of a lawn and a multi-story house, move into a condo or an apartment or assisted living.
Great, thanks, Ken. Drew, what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Vanessa. It's good to be with everybody today. So I took a slightly different approach, is usually my way to go. So I came up with two axioms, less than factors. The first one I think will be familiar to most economists, is try not to assume rationality among market participants or analysts. And the second is housing plays such an important role. It's an important and complex role in the lives of households and markets. So underestimate this and simplify it at your own risk.
That's great, Drew. And so kind of one of our panelists isn't like the others. That might be Drew. And that's not just because of what he just shared with us, but also he's an academic like myself, as are many of the people that are on today's webinar with us. Holly and Ken aren't academics. They're with different institutions, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, as I mentioned, and then Associated General Contractors. And so as economists, we're always looking for places to get more research. And so Holly, can you tell us first, then we'll move on to Ken, tell us about the research that our economists can access through HUD and how we can better kind of partner with you to access that research.
Yeah, for sure. So HUD is a big umbrella and there's lots of offices and then divisions within it. So pretty far down the chain in the Office of Policy Development and Research. And then in there, the Economic and Market Analysis Division. So our primary function is we have 40 economists throughout the country for every HUD region. And we write and do research on metropolitan areas, MSAs particularly. And then we look at those. We provide a 3-year forecast of population growth, of job growth, and of housing demand. Both, we break it out between renter-occupied demand and owner-occupied demand as well. And so we do that for the major metropolitan areas in the country, and we publish all of that online. We like to update, every other year we try to do that. And then from there, we go down with lower level information, shorter reports, more timely because the forecasts take a while, but it's all available on our website. We do quarterly reports on each region, kind of summarizing state level trends. We do, point and time MSA analysis. And then we do a risk assessment for FHA. So we're in a lot of different spheres, and all of our information is available on our website, and we can definitely share that.
Thanks, Holly. Ken?
The Associated General Contractors of America is the trade association for all types of construction other than single-family home building. So that does include multifamily as well as all kinds of non-residential building construction, and then the utilities and other public works, highways, certainly an important piece of what many members do. We operate through a network of 89 local and state chapters. So I encourage any of you to get involved with AGC in your area. You can find where those chapters are at agc.org. As chief economist, I put out information in a couple of channels. First, I write a weekly one-page summary of economic news relevant to construction called the Data Digest. And I'd be glad to add anyone to the email list if they want to write me at ken.simonson@agc.org. I also work with my boss, our Director of VP for Public Affairs, on 5 press releases each month. So yesterday we put out a release commenting on producer price indexes for construction inputs and also the indexes relating to multifamily construction demand. And we do a monthly assessment of change in construction employment as part of the National Employment Report, but also we rank all states by change in construction employment, both over the latest month or 12 months and since the high water mark of February 2020. And then we do that with 358 metro areas for which the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out at least construction combined with logging and mining in most of them, and some of them it's construction alone. And the 5th release is on construction spending as reported by the Census Bureau on the first business day of each month. We also do a couple of surveys each year. We released one a couple of weeks ago in which over 1,200 of our members told us what their situation is with workforce and their expectations about adding workers in the next year. And around the end of the year, we'll be putting out our annual Hiring and Business Outlook survey. All of that is available on agc.org.
That is such excellent information from both of you. And I have to also pitch partnering with your local AGC chapter. So I love our chapter here in Idaho. Wayne Hammond is the CEO of that chapter, and we've been able to do economic impact analyses for them. So all you economists out there, make sure you connect with your local AGC chapter. Ken, we're going to stick with you, and it has to do a little bit with what you were talking about originally when you started mentioning different types of housing, right? Multifamily is what AGC focuses on, and it makes me start to think about missing middle housing and affordability. So can you see from your side of things, what are you seeing as ways construction of those multifamily, maybe more attainable housing? What does that look like right now?
It's certainly a tough environment for delivering any construction project on time and on budget, because we've had these unprecedented run-ups in materials costs over the last 2.5 years, as well as an unending number of supply chain shocks. So obviously COVID and the initial shutdown of activity and the still felt effects on transportation, on congestion at ports, and on actually getting materials delivered to a site. We're still feeling that, but also things like the freeze in Texas in February of 2021, that damaged all the plants that produce the resins for a variety of construction plastics. So PVC pipe, which is ubiquitous in housing, or vapor barriers, insulation, all of those things were affected. And as a result, it's really hard to keep track of exactly what's going on with the supply chain. Some are national or global effects, others are very localized. But I do try to push out that information. So again, I don't want to plug too much, but be glad to have people contact me or your local AGC chapter to try to follow that. It really does change on a daily basis, as we saw this morning with the announcement that the threatened rail strike has been put off. We'll see if it's a reprieve or actually a pardon.
Thanks, Ken. I do remember that freeze, and I think paint was also affected, the access to paint, which was stopping people from moving into homes that were even already built, but they couldn't get that last kind of little bit done. So Drew, you mentioned you kind of had a cautionary tale at the beginning. That's kind of about how we're using data. And that's kind of the question I'm going to focus on with you right now. So we look at statistics a lot, right? As research economists in and outside of the academy. And sometimes we can think of them as comforting, and they might be masking certain behaviors, right? So when we're just looking at the average and median numbers. So as you look at statistics, are there key trends or patterns that you see behind these larger statistics, right? That can give us more details as economists? Is there something we should be looking into more than we already are?
Thanks, Vanessa. It's a really thoughtful question. And the short answer is one I can't say on Zoom. So I'll just say an emphatic yes. We should look deeper into things. The sort of longer answer is something I learned from some collaborative work working with hydrologists. And just follow me here for a second, but they advise that looking at the central tendency of water flow in a channel means you miss important details happening elsewhere, and that those details create a real richness and context for understanding what's going on in the channel. So for looking at housing, does that mean everybody should rush out and look at quantile regression models for measuring everything? Probably not. But instead, I guess I would say this. Think of it as like developing your eye as an art collector or somebody that pays attention to the details. Look at lots of information, look at lots of examples of the same object, look at a lot of similar phenomena rather, and let what you observe outside the central tendency in something shape your understanding of its variation. That's probably the best thing I can say. Trying to come up with a really good example. And the first one that came to mind was, like rural home price movements with small numbers of sales, right? That seems like a pretty quotidian example. But then I thought there's got to be a better one. And I remembered that my friend Patrick Smith has written a great article in the American Economic Review challenging our assumption about constant quality in resale indices. So it's a really good application of this sort of pay attention at the margins. And you'll pick up a lot of really, really great information.
Thank you, Drew, and thanks for those great examples. I'm going to field the first question that we have from the audience, and for the rest of the audience members, let's use that Q&A function, and we'll make sure that we put your question out there to the panelists. And so, what are the things that we're seeing going on is changing interest rates, and I'll use Boise as an example. We have been targeted, for better or for worse, as one of the most overpriced housing markets in the nation, if not the continent. I've seen both examples. But what we're seeing now is houses are staying on the market a little bit longer, and we're seeing more price drops. So can someone speak to that relationship and what that really means? I don't know if who wants to tackle that one.
I can talk a little bit about Boise. I cover that market for our region. So you're asking about like the supply and demand, like the demand kind of going down because of interest rates and the home prices that follow.
Yeah, and I think not just Boise, but we're kind of seeing that a little bit across the country, right?
Well, I think for one, Boise, has been the recipient of so much net in-migration and from higher cost areas. So that's kind of fueled, the housing price growth there. And I think most people knew it wasn't, eternal. It wasn't going to last forever. Once the disparity between Boise and some of the other areas kind of shrinks, there's less advantage for moving. So I think that maybe some of the demand is probably maybe a reduction of that, of the, net migration. But I also think it's like the housing markets, there's no like real balanced conditions, right? It's so fluid and it's like constantly swinging back and forth that it just seems like a little bit of a realignment to me right now. You couldn't expect 20%, annual price growth for forever and still have enough people to purchase them. So those are my two thoughts.
Thanks, Holly. Drew or Ken, do either of you want to add anything to that?
I think she covered it well from my standpoint. That's certainly the slowdown and many indicators of it, days on market, bids or accepted bids below asking price versus so many going over and multiple bids. Those things are changing very fast. I just saw a minute ago a story in the Denver Post about that. And here in DC, where I live, it's been the same story. Very abrupt change over really 2 months, 3 months at the most.
I would also say it's kind of that math that Drew was talking about, maybe prices drop 5% because of, the interest rates and the demand shift. But if you look at, like, we shouldn't be comparing to the last 3 years, right? Like, that's not a normal, I don't know if there was a normal period, but definitely that's like an unprecedented time, right? So I don't think, the story of potential price drops and stuff sounds scarier, I think, than it is if you use a different baseline.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Holly. So I'm going to kind of pop back to this audience question. I think is really well suited for Ken, and I think Drew and Holly could also add to it. So some of the narrative that we were just talking about was a lot about ownership, home ownership, and so this is more about that family rental market. And Ken, are we seeing any change in multifamily construction or demand for multifamily in the last couple of years? And then I guess along those same lines, any change in just the commercial construction in general since COVID and remote work?
Well, the number one concern for a lot of contractors is labor availability. That's beginning to edge past materials cost increase, because some of those are starting to come down. We saw yesterday's producer price index, the inputs to construction index dropped for the second month in a row. It's still up by double digits over the year and up by more than the overall producer price index or the CPI, but nevertheless, no longer a 20% plus increase in those materials costs, which we saw for 12 straight months. But the challenge of finding workers to get the job done is paramount. In the survey that I mentioned that AGC released last month, we had 93% of our respondents said that they had openings and for craft workers. 91% said that those positions were hard to fill, and it was across the board. We asked about 21 different crafts, and every one of them, a majority of contractors said those were hard to fill. On this salaried side, it was almost as bad. So this is certainly affecting multifamily as well as other kinds of contractors. It's a little different with the single family market that they do have. They use a different skill set to a degree, but to the extent that single family is now slowing down, I would expect to see a decline in employment there. I was a little surprised when the August employment figures came out 10 days ago that there was still an increase in what BLS calls residential construction employment. They actually have 5 segments of construction that they report on. And so I divide those into residential and non-residential. Residential has been one of the strongest growing markets for employment across all industries. And it's still growing, but I do think that will change. Some of those workers will then migrate into non-residential or specifically into multifamily. So I think to the degree that there are people who say, oh, I'm ready to move, or I have to move, my job is now going to be remote, or I can come to Boise and live there instead of high-priced Seattle, then they may not want to buy a house right now. They don't know how long they would stay, and they may find that 6.02% mortgage rate is too much. But they're still ready to move into a flashy new, bigger apartment building. So this shift may help multifamily for the moment, but certainly any kind of project that depends on getting rents or hotel room rates is vulnerable to that increase in financing costs. The developer has to be able to push up the rents enough to cover the additional construction and financing costs. So I would put multifamily on the watch list now. As for type of multifamily, that is really going to vary according to the market that you're in, as to whether it's going to be middle class, so-called student and early working level, or affluent.
Thanks, Ken. I think that really sets us up for the next question for Holly, which is kind of on the more on the demand side. We're really talking about the supply side and now the demand side. So when we think about density, locations, aging in place, and other factors, there seems to be maybe a shift in the way the demand for housing will change. And Ken was kind of alluding to that. How is HUD, and how are you as an economist at HUD considering some of these more macro-based trends?
Well, so we get developers that want FHA financing, which is an insurance program essentially. And then we look at their projects. So I really kind of focus on a subset in that respect. But we do, we have probably for the past like 6-7 years, we've got a significant amount of independent living developments that come in. And they seem to do great. It seems to be a product type that people, are really looking for, especially in the areas that I guess up until recently had a lower cost of living like Boise or, some of the inland, smaller, but still with all the services type areas. So we've been seeing a lot of that. And I would like, in terms of like just my research, we have really kind of focused on more of the more rural areas in our region. So like Wenatchee was really highlighted. That's like the Lake Chelan resort area, kind of those areas that have the quality of life and lower housing costs that are now, people more people can, I guess mobility has increased with the remote work. And so we're looking into those areas and kind of, how, because these trends kind of started before COVID, but COVID was really a catalyst, like, especially like working in the federal government. Like I really believe COVID took like 20 years worth of progress and like smashed it down to happen in 2 years. And so we got to sort through all of the, benefits and costs that maybe weren't so evident, when the changes had to happen. So, yeah. So it depends, I guess, long story short.
A lot of the answers, right? It depends, right? It depends, right? How, and I think we especially during COVID, when you have a shock to the system like that, we think we might know, we might be able to forecast, we kind of have an idea of how things are going. And then we have this shock to the system that, kind of provides a new frame of reference for us. So,
Right.
Drew, so, we're talking about the supply chain and the demand side. How do you see from your perspective, where you sit, how the market is adapting to these changing preferences of type of housing and whatnot? And then how might that affect the quality of housing that's being produced out there?
Thanks. Speaking to the earlier question, there's a great joke about econometricians are great at predicting the past with increasing specificity. So Holly, I feel you on that. In terms of changing tastes and preferences, I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. But I'd say tastes and preferences are always changing, and I think that probably the biggest takeaway from thinking about housing a lot for the last 20 years is that it's a market in constant search of equilibrium, but it's never really achieving it. So tastes and preferences are part of that striving. On the quality side, I mean, the answer is, most assuredly, yes, pay attention to it. Houses are large durable goods, and they're the largest and most expensive asset most households own and invest in. But when we talk about quality, I think there are a couple dimensions that are important to pay attention to. Construction quality is obviously the first one that comes to mind, but I think it's important to consider construction quality relative to transportation, operational expenses, and capital expenses. You can imagine what getting that equation wrong looks like as a household, right? It's not pretty, and it's really hard to correct. And so I'd say that's, certainly let's pay attention to what's happening on the construction quality side, but let's anchor it in our understanding of what it costs to own, operate, and fix housing over time. And then the second thing is the quality of location. And that's, it's probably one that's a little bit further afield, but I'll go out on a limb and say that most of the theory and all of the evidence, both academic and tacit, suggests that most of us can't afford the exact house we want in exactly the place we want. So that means we satisfy, so we make trade-offs, right? And I think that we should be talking about what those trade-offs mean relative to things like access to schools, the quality of the urban form surrounding the house, access to food, air and water quality. I think when we talk about housing and housing quality, those are important dimensions that we also need to be paying attention to, both in, at the applied level, but also at the policy level, because they do play a significant role in sort of how housing feels as an occupant.
That's really good. Thank you. And I think that you touched on kind of the overall cost of housing. It's beyond what we usually take into consideration, what the data usually gives us, right? So that there's been a move to figure out a way to have transportation costs related to where people need to go to work, for instance, or to get to school, to have that be part of the equation. So we, on the lines of where could we afford to live, right? And where we want to live. Every year we do an annual survey in the School of Public Service. It's a public opinion survey in the state of Idaho. And last year we started asking across the state and not just in the Treasure Valley, if someone had to leave their home today for any reason, would they be able to find a home of equal quality at the same price? And over 70%, I think it was 72% of Idahoans said, no, there's no way I could do that. And so, and when we looked, we'd been doing that same question in the Treasure Valley for a number of years, and that has continued to go up, not surprisingly, right, in the last couple of years. But I like to think, what does that mean for the new generation of youth and other leaders that want to come to the state? If the current population couldn't even move, what about the new people coming into the state, right? Or those students graduating from our colleges? So Ken, you touched on this a little bit about supply chain issues and the labor shortage. And so as us as economists, as we're trying to forecast, we've kind of established that forecasting is really hard, right? What sort of nuances should we take into consideration in our forecasting? We're developing these models. Is there anything we haven't discussed that we as economists need to take into consideration?
Well, I get asked all the time, what's the one variable that you can use to predict construction? And the answer after 21 years in this job is, I don't have one. That while to me as a layman, anybody in a hard hat and working with yellow iron looks like they're doing the same job. The drivers for the different kinds of construction really vary a great deal. The methods, whether it's the materials, the equipment, the way that the labor is organized or used, all of those are very project type specific. So the Census Bureau does report on over 170 categories of construction in its monthly spending report. And I guess you could take any of those and build a set of predictors for them. But even that would leave you with some big gaps, because a public school versus a public university versus a private one, fundraising, very different pattern, approvals for getting the contractor or the design, all those things change. And of course, site makes a huge difference. What are the soil conditions, the zoning laws, the inspection and all those things. So while I would love to give you all the cookbook that I use, I don't have it.
Thank you. And that might not be surprising to anyone, right? So I'm going to look at some additional audience questions we have coming in. And the first one, this is really interesting, something that we really haven't touched on. The question is, how do natural disasters affect the supply and demand of housing? And she's thinking of not just where we're constructing it, but thinking of future repairs. So is there one of you that maybe is?
Well,
go ahead, Ken.
Let me start with a related answer. Is that I frequently see stories in the media about prices shooting up for certain materials, or the expectation that they will shoot up because you've had a hurricane soak a lot of properties, or a wind event tearing off roofs, those kinds of things. But the reality is that These days, I think the supply chain is nimble enough that you don't get national effects. They may be localized, they may be short term, but even the supply of blue tarp seems to respond very quickly. And indeed, we've seen stories over the last couple of decades of the big home improvement chains pre-positioning trailers full of supplies that are likely to be needed to do that. Having said that, that's really just the response to stabilizing what's left. The replacement process tends to be much longer than people expect, again, because you have all kinds of layers of legislation, regulations, zoning, financing, and seldom is all the money available promptly to do rebuilding. And there are a lot of questions about, do you build in the same area that's clearly vulnerable to flooding or erosion or whatever, fires? Do you build to a higher level of protection? And also, are there any jobs left in that area for the people to come back to, or are they going to relocate permanently? So you have both shorter term impacts than I think is generally expected, and then much longer term in terms of reestablishing the supply. And some places like Homestead, Florida, I think, which was hit by a devastating hurricane over 30 years ago. I'm not sure the population ever came back. It certainly has not in New Orleans, that was hit so bad by Hurricane Katrina 17 years ago this month.
Vanessa, could I add one or two?
Yeah, I was actually going to call on you, Drew. Yeah, go for it.
So a couple things come to mind, and they're largely out of the sort of academic world. And I'll cover more than just housing here, I think, because it's an important thing. So extreme weather events are, most assuredly exogenous shocks, right? Extreme things that happen and, frustrate economic outcomes. Mortgage defaults, both commercial and residential, have been observed relative to these things. And changes in value, right, on a intertemporal basis. So short term, at some period after the storm or the event, have been observed, right? So it's exactly what you think would happen. The bigger question, I think, is what's the long-term cumulative effect of or forward-looking problem related to climate risk? Which I suspect the question is somewhat related to is, yes, we can look backwards and see how markets have responded. But because of the complexity of what climate science tells us, right, the past may not be much of a predictor for what's coming. And so I think that it's it's going to take all of our collective brain power to wander forward on this one. So it's a great question, and I think there's some answers, but future mileage is definitely going to vary.
This is a little off our script, and so we'll see if we can tackle this one, but it got me thinking about risk. And those of you that are looking at finance and lending, there's a conversation around the country about what sort of factors, what risk factors should be taken into consideration when it comes to allowing access to capital. And one of the conversations right now is around ESG factors. Are any of you seeing that or paying attention to that conversation? And is the real estate industry participating in any consideration when it comes to ESG factors?
Can you say what is ESG?
Sorry, my apologies. Environment and social governance, right? So some other, I think, other terminology would be sustainability, climate adaptation risk, right? So are you seeing that, and where you consider, are there different risk levels based on where those factors might have, considerable differences?
I'm so glad you asked, Vanessa, because today the ULI is releasing a report on that I helped author. So thanks for the incredible softball. But no, I think it's a really important question, and obviously there's significant debate about it. I think the biggest sort of thing to take away that most people on this call will have some insight into is that there's this great paper called Taming the Factor Zoo, right? There's all this wonderful stuff about data mining versus factors that actually predict what's going on. And there's a significant debate about what ESG factors, are material and meaningful to forward-looking, returns and asset prices. And so I think that's the conversation to start having is, like what is the data? How do you actually measure the complexity of what's going on? And how do you convert the complexity of climate science into financial risk modeling in a meaningful way that firms can understand, they can deploy in, discounted cash flow modeling, and can be used to, as outputs to drive real, actual economic decisions.
That's great. Drew, thank you for, and I honestly, everyone on this webinar, I had no idea. I promise you that Drew just co-authored an article about this, so that wasn't planted. I truly did not know that, and I'm looking forward to reading that article, Drew. Another audience question here: how does housing affordability factor into each of your research? So they are asking for each of the panelists, how do you consider housing affordability, or if you do, with your research? And then I guess a follow-up question to it are, what are the implications of the lack of affordable housing in metropolitan areas around the nation? So I guess if you are looking at affordability at all, and then what are the implications of the lack of affordability? I
can start.
Holly? Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah, so we kind of have some indices that we produce with similar, just publicly available data sets to kind of look at first-time home buyer affordability. We look at income bands and the median priced home and a 20% down payment, current interest rate, and kind of try to determine, what percentage of, that population could afford the median price home in an area. It's typically pretty low. And I cover everything on the West Coast, so our markets are a lot different than other parts of the country. And so we look at that. We also look at a renter affordability index, and it's similar, looking at median rents versus income changes. And in most places, like in the larger cities, the affordability has declined. But we've also seen, uptick in net in-migration to the areas where it was, more affordable. And so, I'm not sure there's a lack of affordable housing. I think that there is a lack of affordable housing where people want it. And so it's, maybe some incentive structure needs to be, discovered to help that movement, go where it's available. But I also think zoning is, a big deal. A lot of our cities are zoned 70% single family. And that's a local government kind of thing to deal with. I think I'll stop there and let somebody else join in.
I'd say that
Holly. Ken, yeah.
Yeah, I don't track affordability per se, but it's certainly one of the things that I look at in order to explain why population is growing in a given area or not, and therefore demand for construction overall. Or conversely, why have we suddenly seen a decline in California's population? There are a number of things, but affordability is very high on that list. And conversely, Boise doing very well. I'd say Colorado is an interesting case where for a long time it was seen as a more affordable choice to West Coast cities, but more recently population growth in Colorado, specifically in the Denver area, slowed down a good deal. And more growth has shown up in northern Utah and in Idaho. And some of that I'm hearing is because of people saying, oh, Colorado has gotten too high priced. So there are stories that change quite a bit in a relatively few years. But to figure it into construction modeling, I don't take it that far.
Well, and I think that the mobility, the increase in, mobility of people that have remote jobs, I think that it'll take a really long time to see, how these changes play out. But, all else equal, I would expect that to help, moderate the affordability, concern in places. If you have a job that lets you move, easily, then, that it's kind of a smaller scale of what Californians were doing. I think which also makes me think that there's a lot more, research and questions at like the more micro level now than there really has been in the past, which is fascinating and interesting and exciting for me as a researcher to start looking into. It's just where the data is. I don't know.
Thanks, Hallie. Drew, what about your research? How do you touch on affordability?
Well, the short answer is right now I'm not. I've had a honest answer. I've had a little more focus on the commercial real estate market for the last couple of years. But I would say this rather than talk about my own research, which I know academics love to do. I'll just avoid doing that for a minute. I would say probably the best way to engage this topic is each state, to my knowledge, has a great state-funded housing research center, right? Or a group like Business Economic Research Center, right? That is doing this kind of work and engaging these topics on a pretty regular basis. And they usually produce fabulous data that you can use in guide conversations. And I think it's a sort of an important industry academic conversation to engage with continuously. Everybody that I've ever worked with in that space has been, genuinely interested in finding the truth, which I think is probably one of the best attributes that researchers can have. So.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, and I do think that micro level at the state level or even local jurisdictional level is really interesting. In Idaho last year, the state for the first time allocated $50 million to support workforce housing efforts. And we don't have a entity in the state that focuses solely on housing research. Not even really an industry group outside the realtors, and an AGC for multifamily. So Idaho Policy Institute, where I work, put together a housing dashboard so the state could look at the county level of where affordability was and wasn't. And surprise, surprise, all 44 counties in Idaho have at least a third of their population paying more than 30% of their household income on housing, which I was like, oh, wow, that's significant, right? And so, but it allowed the state to say, oh yeah, it's actually really affecting all of our state, and therefore we should think about how to distribute that funding and support across the state. So we kind of talked a lot about financing. We haven't touched base on people that are participating in the real estate market with cash. So I wanted to kind of move to that. And I know we talked the other day about this and who would be best to answer this question, but we're seeing institutional buyers, private equity, and other entities engage in large-scale cash purchases of not just multifamily, but also single-family homes. What is that doing to change the market?
Well, I think they're not only buying existing homes, but we have this new segment of single-family home construction that is being funded, houses built for rent, whole subdivisions, basically, of single-family built for rent property. And we really need to see more of a business cycle to know if this is going to add stability to what historically was a very volatile segment of the economy. Single family would boom up, say, through 2005, and then just plunged over the next 6 years. And then we had a decade of slow growth until around 2019. So maybe this will stabilize as these investors with hopefully a longer term horizon say, oh, demand is going to remain strong for rental housing. And if home prices go up fast enough, then we can always bail out and sell it. So, but on the other hand, we also have seen the herd mentality in investors that cause wild swings in asset prices.
Thanks, Ken. Drew, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just sort of Ken hit the nail on the head with sort of the institutional buyers, right? And as they professionalized that space, more data became available. It's a little easier to measure, right? So it's easier to track. I would say that like the all cash purchase is challenging at first from a measurement standpoint, right? And I think there should be some great dissertations written in the coming years on this. So any doctoral students out here that are still searching for a topic, this is a really good one. I think the all cash purchase thing is one of those interesting things. It's going to be a cyclical force, right? I mean, the reason that you use an all cash purchase on a non-institutional basis is either because you can afford to, or you want to signal your ability to perform on a contract, right? And so on a cyclical basis, why would you why would you engage in a negative net present value kind of a decision using some sort of all cash tool when the demand is softer, right? And so I would say that it's going to be an interesting cyclical force that will be challenging to measure, right? Piercing corporate veils and all sorts of other things like that make it challenging, especially given the fractured nature of the hundreds of thousands of transactions that are likely going to be in the space.
I also wonder how much of it has to do with, really strong rent growth recently also, which we're seeing slow, at least in my markets that I'm looking at. 2021 was, triple the rent growth any previous period. And it's like now back to, what it was pre-pandemic. So maybe they got too excited and we're expecting 20% rent growth for the next 5 years. I don't know. It does kind of worry me, like taking that supply away from the sales market. There's a lot of things constraining supply. Like it's not just like the construction side. It's, people staying in their houses longer than before. It's people like deciding to upgrade their houses during the pandemic. Maybe if they hadn't upgraded it, they'd be selling it now, but they upgraded it, so they're going to stay for another 15 years. You've got all of these demographic components, I think, playing into the constraints as well.
Well, thank you. And we are just about at time. We have so much more to talk about, James. I'm going to hand it back to you, though.
This was fantastic. Thank all of you for this gift of time you've given all of us today, which I know everyone appreciates a lot. And imagine if you enjoyed this today, just imagine how much you love 3 full days of discussion on a wide variety of economic topics. We invite you to join us for the AUBER annual conference in Pensacola, Florida. That starts October 15th. You can find more information on the conference and a stored copy of today's presentation on the AUBER website. That is www.auber.org. Watch your email on the AUBER website for more information on our next webinar. From all of us at AUBER, thank you for attending and have yourself a wonderful day.
Do we just go now?